That is what the dawn felt like over Jerusalem, as though creation itself had been holding its breath for 3 days and was only now daring to release it. The sky broke open in shades of amber and rose, spilling light across the city walls like liquid gold poured from invisible hands. In the garden beyond the gate, where the wealthy laid their dead among olive trees and flowering shrubs, mist rose from the earth in slow spirals, as if the ground were breathing prayers it had kept hidden in its depths. The stone was moved. Not cracked or chipped or forced aside by human hands, but rolled away as though it weighed nothing, as though the laws that govern matter and weight had simply stepped back and allowed passage. It sat off to the side of the tomb entrance like a discarded seal on a letter already opened, already read, its message delivered and impossible to take back. Inside, the burial shelf stood empty. The linens that had wrapped him lay collapsed upon themselves, still holding the shape of the body they had contained, as though he had passed through them like light through glass, like breath through air, leaving them undisturbed. The cloth that had covered his face was folded separately, not hastily, not carelessly, but with the deliberate precision of one who had all the time in eternity and wanted to leave a message in the arrangement. But Mary Magdalene did not yet know this. She came up the path as the first birds began their tentative songs, testing the morning, calling the sun higher. Her feet moved by memory, her mind wrapped in the fog of grief so thick she could barely see through it. The bundle of spices in her arms felt heavier than it should, as though she carried not just myrrh and aloes but the weight of every moment she had stood at the foot of that terrible cross, watching the only one who had ever truly seen her, had ever cast out the demons and called her back from the edge of madness into the light of herself, die with a cry that had torn the sky in two. She had not slept. How could she? Every time she closed her eyes she saw the nails, the thorns, the spear opening his side like a door no one should have entered, the blood and water pouring out as though his very heart had broken open and spilled its contents for the world to witness. But now she would anoint him properly. Now she would complete the burial rites that the approaching Sabbath had cut short. It was the last thing she could do, the final act of love for one who had loved her back into existence. The tomb came into view and her steps faltered. The stone was wrong. It sat away from the entrance, massive and immovable yet moved, sealed by Roman authority yet unsealed, and the wrongness of it shot through her chest like lightning through storm clouds. Her bundle slipped from her arms, spices scattering across the path in a fragrance that suddenly seemed absurd, pointless, a ritual for the dead when something had gone catastrophically, impossibly wrong. She ran. Not toward the city for help, but toward the tomb itself, her breath catching, her vision blurring with tears she had thought were already spent. The entrance gaped open like a mouth frozen mid-scream, and she stumbled to her knees at its threshold, looking into the darkness within. Empty. The word was a knife. The tomb was empty. The linens were there, yes, arranged in that strange, deliberate way, but he was gone. They had taken him. Even his body, even the small comfort of tending his remains, they had stolen that too. She turned, her chest heaving with sobs that felt like they were tearing her apart from the inside, and that was when she saw the men in white. They were sitting, one at the head and one at the foot of where the body had lain, and they were not men at all, though she had no other word for them. They wore white that hurt to look at directly, white that seemed to generate its own light, white that belonged to some other order of creation entirely. Their faces were beautiful and terrible simultaneously, and the air around them shimmered as though reality were thinner in their presence, as though the veil between worlds grew transparent where they sat. "Woman," one of them said, and his voice was like bells, like music from a language she had never learned but somehow understood. "Why are you weeping?" The question was so simple and so impossible. Why was she weeping? Because the world had ended 3 days ago. Because God had died. Because hope itself had been buried in this tomb and now even his body was gone. "They have taken away my Lord," she said, her voice breaking on every word, "and I do not know where they have laid him." The angels, for what else could they be, looked at each other with expressions she could not read. Not pity. Not amusement. Something older and deeper, as though they were witnessing a moment they had waited centuries to see, a moment written before time began and only now unfolding in the sequence mortals called history. And then she felt it. A presence. Behind her. Close enough that she could sense the displacement of air, the subtle shift in atmosphere that comes when someone enters a room, when aloneness becomes accompanied. She turned slowly, her tears making everything blurry, and saw a figure standing in the garden path. A man, she thought. Perhaps the gardener, risen early to tend the grounds. The sun was behind him, turning him into a silhouette, a shape cut from darkness and placed against the dawn light. She could not see his face clearly, but there was something in his posture, something in the way he stood that tugged at the edges of recognition even as her grief-fogged mind could not quite grasp it. "Woman," he said, and his voice was deeper than the angel's, warmer, more human, "why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" The question pierced her. Whom was she seeking? She was seeking the dead. She was seeking the one who had been taken from her by Roman brutality and religious fear. She was seeking a body to anoint, a corpse to mourn, an ending to accept because accepting endings was all that was left. "Sir," she said, wiping at her eyes uselessly, "if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." As though she could. As though a woman alone could carry a man's dead weight. As though determination and love could overcome the physics of mortality. But grief makes such offers. Desperation proposes such impossibilities. The figure in the light was silent for a moment, and in that silence, something in the garden changed. The mist seemed to still its rising. The birds fell quiet mid-song. Even the breeze that had been stirring the olive leaves went motionless, as though all of creation were holding its breath again, waiting for something that had never happened before and would never happen again. And then he spoke her name. Mary. One word. 2 syllables. The sound she had heard 1,000 times from 1,000 lips, but never like this. Never with this inflection, this warmth, this perfect knowledge of who she was and who she had been and who she was becoming. Her name in his mouth was not just identification but resurrection, not just recognition but recreation. It was the sound of her whole self, every broken piece, every demon-haunted night, every moment of shame and restoration, being spoken into wholeness. The world exploded into color. She gasped, and it was like breathing for the first time, like surfacing from deep water into air. The blur cleared from her eyes and she saw him. Not the gardener. Not a stranger. Not a ghost or vision or desperate hallucination born from grief. Him. Jesus. Her Lord. Her teacher. Her rescuer. Standing before her in the breaking dawn with a body that was somehow the same and utterly different, familiar and transfigured. Bearing the marks of death but radiating life in a way that made the rising sun seem dim by comparison. Rabboni. The word tore from her throat, half cry and half song, the Aramaic title that meant teacher but contained worlds more. Master, Lord, the one whose words had authority over demons and disease and death itself. She lunged forward, her whole body moving before her mind could catch up, her arms reaching to embrace him, to hold him, to prove to herself through touch that he was real, that this was not another cruel trick of exhausted hope. She needed to grasp his feet, to cling to him, to anchor him to earth so he could never be taken away again. But he stepped back. It was gentle, the movement. Not harsh or cold, but definite. Unmistakable. His hand came up, not pushing her away but creating a space, a boundary, a sacred distance that must not yet be crossed. "Touch me not," he said. The words stopped her as surely as if he had placed a wall of glass between them. Her hands hung suspended in the air, her face shifting from joy to confusion to hurt in the space of a heartbeat. Touch me not? After everything? After death and grief and this impossible resurrection, he tells her not to touch him? But his face held no coldness. His eyes, those eyes that had seen her demon-possessed and had spoken wholeness over her madness, held such depth of love that it almost hurt to look at them. And in his expression was something else too, something she had never seen before. A kind of holy tension, as though he stood between two worlds and could not fully belong to either one yet. "Touch me not," he said again, and his voice carried layers she was only beginning to understand, "for I have not yet ascended to my Father." The garden seemed to lean in, listening. The mist that had stilled now swirled slowly around them both, and in its patterns Mary thought she could see shapes, wings perhaps, or the outlines of beings who stood invisible just beyond the edge of mortal sight. The air tasted of ozone and myrrh, of lightning and incense, of earth and eternity meeting in the space between his words. He was explaining something without explaining it, revealing a mystery through prohibition, teaching through distance what proximity could not yet convey. "I have died," he said softly, and his voice was the voice of a man but also something greater, something that made the ground beneath her knees hum with recognition. "I have poured out my blood. I have become the offering that was promised before the foundations of the world were laid. But the work is not yet finished, Mary." He turned slightly, his face toward the brightening sky, and in that moment she saw it, saw what he was becoming even as he stood before her. He was still Jesus, still her teacher, but he was also something more now. He was clothed in resurrection glory, wearing mortality and immortality simultaneously, standing at the intersection of death conquered and ascension pending. "Before the world began," he continued, his voice taking on a resonance that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere. There was a pattern established. A priest would enter the Holy of Holies once each year, carrying blood that was not his own, wearing garments made holy through ritual, set apart from all common touch. He would pass through the veil and stand before the mercy seat, and there he would sprinkle the blood that maintained the covenant, that covered the sins of the people for another year. Mary listened, her hands still raised, her heart pounding with a mixture of worship and confusion and dawning comprehension. But that blood, Jesus said, and now his eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, could never truly cleanse, could only cover, could never perfect, it could only postpone. Every year the priest returned because every year the blood lost its power. The shadow could never become the substance. The pattern could never transcend itself. He took a slow breath, and in that breath, Mary heard the sound of every prayer ever prayed, every sacrifice ever offered, every desperate plea for mercy that had risen from human lips since Eden's gates were closed. "But I am both priest and offering," he said. "I am the lamb and the minister. I carry not the blood of bulls and goats but my own blood, shed willingly, poured out completely, given once for all. And now I must ascend. I must pass through the heavens as the high priest passed through the veil. I must enter the true Holy of Holies, the throne room where my Father dwells in unapproachable light, and there I must present this blood before him." Around them, though Mary could not see it with mortal eyes, the unseen watchers drew closer. Angels who had witnessed the creation of stars and the fall of Lucifer now pressed in to see this moment, this hinge of history, this fulfillment of every prophecy and promise. Heaven itself seemed to hold its breath. "If you touch me now," Jesus said gently, and his gentleness made the weight of his words even heavier, "if mortal hands embrace me before I have completed this sacred journey, the offering is compromised. The purity is broken. The consecration is undone." He paused, letting her absorb this, letting the reality sink into her spirit like water into parched ground. The earthly priest could not be touched as he made his way to the mercy seat. How much more must I remain untouched as I prepare to enter not a tent made with hands, but the very presence of the Almighty? I must present this blood unstained by the common, uncompromised by the profane, perfect in its purity because it is the final sacrifice, the last offering, the blood that will speak better things than the blood of Abel. Mary's hands slowly lowered, not in rejection but in reverence. She was beginning to understand, beginning to see beyond the surface of the prohibition to the cosmic significance beneath it. He was not refusing her love. He was completing it. He was not creating distance but preparing the way to abolish distance forever. "When I have ascended," he said, and now his voice held promise, held future, held hope beyond the present moment's restriction. "When I have stood before my Father and presented this blood and secured eternal redemption, not for a year but for all time, not for one nation but for all nations, then I will return. Then you may touch me. Then there will be no barrier, no veil, no separation between my people and my presence." He looked at her with such love that tears spilled down her cheeks again, but these were different tears. Not tears of grief but of worship, not tears of loss but of overwhelming, incomprehensible grace. "But first," he said, "I must complete what I have begun. The Lamb must ascend to the throne. The priest must enter the sanctuary. The blood must be presented and accepted so that the way may be opened, not for one man once per year, but for anyone at any time who will come through me." The light around him was changing now, becoming brighter, more intense, as though the sun itself were jealous of the radiance building around his form. His garments, the simple clothes of a man, were being transformed, were catching light and multiplying it, were becoming something between fabric and glory, between matter and majesty. "Go," he told her, his voice becoming distant now, becoming something that resonated from a place beyond the garden, beyond the earth. "Go to my brothers. Tell them I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Tell them the way is being opened. Tell them the veil is being torn from top to bottom. Tell them that what has been promised since the serpent bruised my heel in Eden is now being fulfilled before the throne of heaven." And he began to rise. Not dramatically, not with thunder or earthquake or angels trumpeting their attendance. Simply, inevitably, like morning mist rising toward the sun, like prayers ascending through incense smoke, like love climbing toward its source. His feet lifted from the garden soil, and where they had stood, the grass seemed greener, more alive, as though even the earth had been touched by resurrection. Mary fell to her knees, not reaching for him now but releasing him, not grasping but letting go, not demanding but worshipping. Her hands lifted not to hold but to bless, not to touch but to honor. And as he rose higher, The light around him intensified until she had to shield her eyes, until his form became a brightness too great for mortal sight, a glory that belonged to heaven and only momentarily had walked among them. The air around her vibrated with a sound that was not quite sound, a resonance that seemed to come from the fabric of reality itself, as though all creation were humming a note too deep for human ears but felt in every cell, every atom, every particle of existence. She realized she was hearing worship. Not her own, though she added her voice to it, but the worship of beings she could not see, angels who had waited since the morning stars sang together to witness this moment, this ascension, this completion of the work that had begun before time itself was born. And then he was gone. Not vanished. Not disappeared as though he had never been. But gone into a brightness beyond mortal comprehension, into the true Holy of Holies where the earthly one had only ever been a shadow, into the presence of the Father to present the blood that would speak mercy louder than all the voices of accusation combined. Mary remained on her knees in the garden as the regular sounds of morning slowly returned. The birds resumed their singing. The breeze stirred the olive leaves again. The mist continued its slow rise toward the warming sky. But everything was different now. The world looked the same, yet nothing would ever be the same again. She understood now why he had said, "Touch me not." It was not rejection but love of the highest order. It was not distance but the necessary preparation for intimacy beyond anything she could have imagined. He had not pushed her away. He had gone ahead to prepare the way, to open the door, to tear the veil so that she, and all who would come after her, could approach the throne of grace with boldness, could enter the presence of God without fear of being consumed. The prohibition had been temporary. The promise was eternal. She rose slowly, her legs shaking, her heart too full for the boundaries of her chest. She had been given a message to deliver, a commission to fulfill. She must run back to the others, must tell them what she had seen, what she had heard, what had happened in this garden while the world was still waking. But first she turned back to the empty tomb one more time. The angels were gone now. The supernatural light had faded. It looked like any other tomb in any other garden on any other morning. But she knew better. She knew that in this place, death had been defeated. In this place the Lamb had emerged victorious. In this place the High Priest had begun his ascension to the true sanctuary, carrying blood that would satisfy divine justice and unleash divine mercy simultaneously. The fragrance of the spilled spices still hung in the air, mixing with the scent of morning flowers and dew-wet earth. It smelled like worship. It smelled like the moment between Good Friday's darkness and Resurrection Sunday's light. It smelled like the garden where humanity fell and the garden where humanity was restored. Mary turned and ran down the path toward the city, toward the disciples who would not believe her at first, toward the message that would change everything. "I have seen the Lord. He is risen. And he is ascending to the Father to complete the work that will open heaven's door to all who believe." Behind her, the garden settled into stillness, not the stillness of death, but the stillness of holy ground, of a place where eternity had touched time and left its fingerprints in the grass, in the stone, in the air itself. The tomb stood empty, its stone rolled aside, its mission completed. And in heaven, beyond the sight of mortal eyes, in the throne room where seraphim cover their faces and cherubim cry, "Holy," the great high priest stood before the Father with wounded hands extended, presenting blood that spoke of love stronger than death, of sacrifice sufficient to satisfy infinite justice, of mercy triumphant and grace unleashed. The offering was accepted. The way was opened. And the echo of a love too holy to touch rippled outward from that throne room, through the corridors of heaven, down through the layers of reality, into the hearts of all who would ever kneel in a garden of grief and rise in a garden of resurrection glory. "Touch me not, yet. For I go to prepare a place where you may touch the very heart of God forever."